I'm Greg Jacobs, and I'm explaining question 2 from CSE Practice Exam 2, dated 2013. Okay, so this is the exam we're working on. It's Practice Exam 2, 2013. We're going to scroll down to the second question. Here it is. Each part gives you an output and asks you to write the code that will give you that output. A couple things to note. These three dots right here mean an infinite loop. So this output does not stop at 1, 2. It'll keep going. So when you're writing your code, make sure that you write it for an infinite loop. Basically, this question is focused on your knowledge of loops. If you can quickly and accurately develop code for these outputs, then you have a deep understanding for loops. This gives you good practice on what I like to call IJ loops as well. Basically, IJ loops are anything like this. That's a pyramid, a block, some type of weird spacing before an output. And anytime you see this, you're going to have two loops, one with I, one with J. You can name them whatever. IJ is easier, and J will be somehow related to I. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put each part over here, and I'm going to be doing the code for them over here. Or you don't need to make a class and a main method in your test, but for here, obviously, I have to compile it. For all of my answers, I use for loops. They're a lot better, they're neater, they're faster. So you can do, I'm pretty sure, either all or most of these parts with while loops, but I'm going to use for loops for each one. If you're someone who really likes while loops, I suggest that you try to do for loops, as they'll make the rest of the class a lot easier. So let's get started with the first one. It's a very simple one. There's 4 terms and I increments. So let's just start with a for loop. Always remember to put int, and don't forget that on a test, because you can't compile it on a test. So you really got to remember that. So int I, and start at 0. This is just a basic loop. And since there's 4 terms and the counter starts at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, I shouldn't equal 4, like less than or equal, because I'll give you 5 terms, because the way Java works is it starts counting at 0. So do equal 0 and then less than the amount of terms. That's always a good way to remember it. So I++, just do system dot out dot print ln. Always remember these quotes when you do these in a test. Also, remember the space. Just try to remember every little thing. A lot of people understand most of the stuff, but then forget the little stuff, and then eventually you just start losing points for that. So make sure you don't do that. There's an extra one in there. So let's compile it now. Okay, so there you go. 0, 1, 2, 3. For part B, I'm going to leave the answer for part A. Let's do system.out.println. So just to give it a little separation between each one. Part B, there's 2 variables that are changing. There's the first row, and then there's the second row. This is the one that has the infinite loop. Be careful, the 3 dots are on the other page. This is going to take 2 for loops, as you can see. The way you should do any of these is look at the output and think about the pattern that you see. Instead of just starting to write for loops right away, think about what you're going to do before you start writing. So for this one, obviously there's a for loop for, let's say the first row is I. It will increment by 1. And for each of those i's, there'll be a j that will increment and then go back to 0 when I changes to 1. So let's start with the I loop. Remember the ints. What you want to do is, in order for it to loop infinitely, do I is greater than something less than 0. So -1's fine. You can do -1 billion if you want, but -1 is fine. Anything that will make it increment, as forever. So that will take care of the first set of numbers. Now the second set of numbers, you want to do another for loop. This is what I call ij loops. It's always good to use ij. You can use whatever you want, but if you use the same variables each time, it kind of sticks in your brain better. J goes from 0 to 2, so if it starts at 0, then you can say j less than 3, and j also increments. So now you have your for loops, and you're going to need to print out each statement with the I and the j, and don't forget these brackets and the comma. So print ln remember that when your variable is surrounded by things that are quoted, that you want to put plus signs on each side. So, and then plus j, quote, and semicolon. You also want to reset j each time because j doesn't go to 3 here, it goes to 0. So make sure you do int. And you got to put int here because the brackets for the for loop end before this j, so it won't know what you're talking about if you close the for loop and then just put j. So make sure you do int j equals 0. That will reset j for each time I increments. So basically what this is doing is I starting at 0 and j starting at 0. So for I 0, j 0, it's going to print out with the brackets and everything. Oh, that needs to be like that. The brackets and everything, 0, 0. Then j is going to increment to 1, so it'll be 0, 1, and then to 2, 0, 2. J resets, I goes to 1, and then it's going to do it again, so it'll be 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2. And this will keep looping forever because of this term. So let me save it. Alright, cool. So the way to stop an infinite loop, because it'll just keep going, is you got to hit Control and C at the same time. Sometimes it takes a couple tries. Okay, so it's kind of hard to see here. Let's pretend that it's just in the beginning. So 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 0, 2, 1, 2, 2. Keeps going, and I keeps getting bigger and bigger. So the next part is C. So what I'm going to do before I do that, I'm just going to change this to like less than 5 or something, so it's not infinite anymore. So I can leave it up here so we can have the whole printout of everything after. Line print there, so it separates problem C from problem B. And let's start again. So basically the point of C is to test your knowledge of how to determine whether I is even or odd. That sounds like it's really hard to do, but it's actually really easy. There's just one command you got to do. So let's start with the for loop. So I starts at 1, so for int I equals 1, and then I is increasing, so we got to put a max value on I. It's 9 because this last looping will be I equals 8, and then I increments. So that should be very obvious. So now, instead of just printing out I equals 1, I equals 2, I equals 3, you need to get rid of the evens and put looping instead. So the easy way to do this is an if statement. So you do if I, that sign, 2 equals 0. So basically what this is saying is if 2 goes into I so many times and returns a remainder of 0. You don't care how many times 2 goes into I. And the remainder being 0 tells you that I is even. Because if 2 goes into 3, it goes in 3 once and it leaves a remainder of 1. So I would be odd and you wouldn't do this if statement. But if I is 10, 2 goes into I 5 times and there's no remainder, so it would be even. So this takes care of all the evens. So if you look at the code, it's for every even, you just put looping. Okay. And just write looping. And for everything else, you want to write the general statement, I equals space plus I. So if we compile it here, okay, so that's the first one, second one, and there you go. D is probably the trickiest one out of all of these. The only tricky part is understanding the pattern and knowing how to use that pattern in your for loops. When I was doing D, I found it helped to write this pattern out. Here's the pattern. So what's happening is you start with 1 and you start with a counter of 0 and you add them together and you get 1. So this row is the outputs. So this will be I. You take this answer and you make that this value. So 1 plus 1 equals 2. Take the 2, put that here. 2 plus 2 equals 4. Take the 4, put it here. 4 plus 3. This second row is just incrementing by 1 each time. So that should be pretty obvious that there's a for loop that increments from 0 to less than 6. And this will start out as 1, and then you always just make, let's say this is variable A, B, and C. You always make A equal to C after you're done, and that will just keep looping. Now that we have our pattern and we know what we're going to do with it, let's get started. So like I said, you're going to have to define this first. Just start as 1. So just do int A. We'll just use the ABC. Int A equals 1. All right, now you can do your for loop for this second row. So for int, remember int B, and B starts at 0, obviously, and then B counts up to 5, so it's less than 6. B increments each time. Now you have to define your output variable. You can make it I. I put C here, so I'm just going to make it C. Int C equals A plus B, just like I wrote in my little cheat sheet down here. So now it's time to print out your statement. I equals plus C. Oh, sometimes it does that. Okay, so you're printing out C each time, which is what you want, because you want to print out this. And then you want to make sure you make A equal to C after each time you print. All you have to do is do A equals C. And that's all there is to it. This one looks really tricky in the beginning, but if you just write out how to do it, it's not bad at all. So let's compile it. All right, so there you go. 1, 2, 4, 7, 11, 16. On to part E. For int I equals 9. Obviously, I is greater than 0. So we'll go all the way down to 1. I decrements. But instead of doing this statement up here, which we use this symbol to find a remainder, which we could do. We could make this 1, and then that would show us all the odds. We can instead just make it a lot easier by doing minus equals 2. So this will decrement I by 2 every time instead of by 1 every time. So with that, this turns into a really simple problem. Cool. And that should about do it. So let's check it out. Cool, so there you go. 9, 7, 5, 3, 1, and it stops. So that's part E. So now on to part F. So when you're in an exam and you flip the page and you see something like this, you might start worrying. It's actually really not that bad as long as you just do it systematically and think about what you're doing. So I'm going to make the rows pretty much. So there's 6 rows. So if I start I equals 6 and then go down to I equals 1, because it has to decrement. So that will create the 6 rows. And there will also be a J for loop as well, which will pretty much print out what's in the rows. The J is going to be related to the I, because as you see here, if I make I equals 6 and then go down to I equals 1, the final value of each of these things is I. You can say in your J for loop that J is less than or equal to I. And that's going to make this a lot easier. So let's start with the I. So int I equals 6. I greater than 0. We are going to decrement I each time. So that's the I loop. And now, oops. Make sure you do the right brackets. Alright, now the J loop will come right after it. There's nothing in between those just yet. You want J to start at 1 because it's printing out a 1 first. So, and then, like I said, J will be less than or equal to I. So this will, when I increment J here, and then I write my print statement, it's going to go, for this one, it's going to be 1 to 6, 1 to 5, 1 to 4. So that will give us the right amount of terms in each row. And now we put our print statement in. We're going to print out the number first before the space. So do print out J and then a plus. And then in order to get it to be rows instead of just printing out one long thing is after your for loop, put a print line statement with nothing in it. So each time you're done with the J's, it's going to print a line and then start again with the I's. Right. Oops. So I figured out my error. This is a common one. If you put an ln here, this is print line, then it will go down to the next line after each J. Get rid of that ln, and that will make it print out in a row. Cool. So there you go. For our last part, this is something you might see in exam because it uses spaces. It's basically the same type of thing as F. There's a little trick in there which will help, but it's another IJ loop. We're going to start with I equals 2, and we're going to go up to I less than 9 or less than or equal to 8. And we'll do our little trick here except with incrementing. So it'll be plus equals 2. And then the J loop will take care of the spaces. For int I equals 2, I less than 9, I plus equals 2. So that'll increment by 2 each time. Before we do the J loop, we want to put a print statement here, not ln, just normal, that says I equals that. Print out this I equals for each line before any spaces happen. So now we have that for int J. J is going to start at 1, or we can make this spaces. I counted this as 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces. And this is spaces less than. So here's the trick. For IJ loops, a lot of the times you want to relate J, or in this case spaces, to I. You can see that when I equals 2, there's 1 space. When I equals 4, there's 2 spaces. 6, 3 spaces. So clearly the amount of spaces is half of the value of I. You put that right in there. So I over 2 spaces increments. Okay, and now you put in print statement, which is just going to be a space. Oops. Just put a line with I in it. So this is just going to print out whatever I is, 2, 4, 6, or 8, and then it's going to send it to the next line, so it's not all in a row. So let's compile it. Cool. So there you go. Again, this is Greg Jacobs from CSE2, and I hope you found my video helpful.